of live comedy programming for the Gold Coast International Film Festival, Jeffrey Gurian brought us Susie Essman, and both of them killed on stage at the gala benefit that we had on Wednesday evening. And tonight we'll be screening a documentary film he co-produced called The Business of Comedy, as well as doing a Q&A and book signing for his new book, Make 'em Laugh, that features an introduction by Chris Rock. Here with co-writer Richie Tinkin, owner and founder of the legendary comedy club, The Comic Strip, is Jeffrey Gurian.
Keep it going for Regina Gill, everybody. Let her hear it. She's done such an incredible job this week with this festival, and it's been an honor for me to be involved. And thank you all for coming out. Give yourselves a hand for coming out tonight. Come on. Because the truth is that you're the most important people here. We tried this once without an audience. It was horrible. Absolutely horrible. This is a special evening for me. And by the way, not only Regina Gill didn't do this alone, there are a lot of people on her staff. Caroline Sarakoff is here, the assistant director of the festival. And there's a whole bunch of people that made this happen. We've had a great week so far. We had because Long Island was hit so hard by Hurricane Sandy, and there was so much devastation, we decided to make this year special. It's the third year of the film festival, but we decided to turn Long Island into Laugh Island. And so we created some comedy events, culminating in this huge gala that we had on Wednesday night in honor of Susie Essman from Curb Your Enthusiasm. Susie received the Artist of Distinction Award in Comedy, and it was a fantastic gala at this new theater called The Space at Westbury. It was a fantastic event. On Thursday night, we had an event for the Comedy Warriors, soldiers who have been injured so badly in Iraq and Afghanistan, and went on to create comedy careers, thanks to people like Bob Saget and Zach Galifianakis and Lewis Black, who are working with them to coach them to do comedy, and they're actually very funny. And culminating in tonight's event, which I'm honored to be part of, I have two projects in this. And there are three people here that I'm going to ask to stand, and you're going to get to meet them when we do the intermission, because we're going to do a Q&A both for the film, The Business of Comedy, which is a documentary basically about how hard it is to make a living in comedy, which a lot of people are probably curious about it. Very difficult. And which I am in, and also a co-producer of that film. And then we're going to be talking about a book that was a labor of love for me as well, a book called Make 'em Laugh, which is the story of the legendary comedy club, The Comic Strip, which opened in 1976 and launched the careers of Eddie Murphy, Chris Rock, Jerry Seinfeld. It was Jerry Seinfeld's first home for the first 4 years of his career, Paul Reiser, Judah Friedlander, Lisa Lampanelli. So many huge stars came out of that club. And the owner and the founder of that club is here with me tonight. And you're going to get a chance to meet him for the Q&A also. So there are three people that I'd like to stand up for a bow first. Gary Licker and Scott Sobel, who are the executive producers of The Business of Comedy, and they're Long Island residents as well. And the legendary Richie Tinkin. Over here, Richie Tinkin, the owner and the founder of The Comic Strip, who actually managed Eddie Murphy for the first 11 years of his career, from Saturday Night Live days up through Beverly Hills Cop 2. So once the film is over, we're going to have a Q&A. You'll get a chance to ask questions. We're going to tell you some funny stories from all the big stars. And stick around and have fun, okay? Now we'll show the film. What made you do the film in the first place? How'd the idea come about, and how'd you get started?
Well, Scott and I have been friends for 47 years now. Scott was at my 10th birthday party. We were in the same 5th grade class, and we went to same high school together, same college together. We did many college play productions. When we got out of college, Scott hired me to do some commercials for his business, Scott Entertainment. And along the way, we've been doing some documentaries. We did one back in 1994 called Burger Town, and then about 3 years ago, something called Selling Cars in America, which we sold to PBS and CNBC. So anyway, Scott called me on the phone back, it was about a year ago, right around the time Sandy hit, and he said he had an idea for a new documentary, and that was the comedy club scene. We were both, we loved the comedy scene. We grew up with the great comics. I went to Catch a Rising Star. I know Scott had gone to comedy clubs, and we wanted to investigate and see the resurgence of comedy clubs and see where it was and where it is now. So that was really the seed. That was the idea that we had just a year ago, and it's a year later, and we were able to pull this off.
And I have to say that it's an amazing accomplishment that you did. Because I mean, I've met many people over the years who have ideas. They want to do a film. They talk about it. Years go by, they still haven't done it. You know, you guys created this in a matter of months. You were so dedicated. You went out to LA. You spoke to everybody you had to talk to. You went through New York, and you really got it done. I mean, you went into the editing room, and you got the film done. It's a testament to how you can accomplish something if you really want to do it.
Absolutely. Well, it was a labor of love, no doubt about it.
And it shows because the film is great. And not just because we're in it. But, and you know, how I got involved is interesting, and how, you know, it was a labor of love for me too. And maybe you would speak about that. I don't know, I found it interesting. But...
Well, usually when Gary and I venture into these things, we have a process, and we set up interviews, and we let the interviews sort of develop organically. We set up the interviews, we ask the questions, and it's not, you know, the form of this thing doesn't happen right away. It's probably 2 or 3 interviews, 4 interviews into the process where we start to see where this thing is going. It wasn't until we met Jeffrey Gurian, when we met him in his apartment in New York City, that this process started to take form. Because when you speak with Jeffrey Gurian, Jeffrey is a comedian, he's an archivist. He intuitively understands the business of comedy. And so when you're speaking with him, he's giving us the broad strokes, he's giving us the intimate details of this business. So, you know, when we finished up with Jeffrey, I looked at Gary, we looked at each other, and we said, we know where we're going with this thing. He gave us the path, he gave us the journey. They gave us the direction, and so this is how, you know, Jeffrey got involved with us, and this was his big contribution to the documentary.
And you know what's interesting about it, and thank you for saying that, but there's a synchronicity of events in the universe. People get brought together for a purpose. When I agreed to be interviewed, I had no idea what it was going to be or how it was going to, what was going to lead into. And I was so impressed with it, and that's when I brought in Richie Tinkin, and you know, opened the doors for some of the other people to take part in it, because I felt so strongly about the project. But there was like an immediate bond between us. We got along so well.
There was.
And you know, that doesn't always happen. And I said, well, this is something that I really want to get involved in. So it worked out so perfectly, you know. And
It did.
and yeah, and I'm very proud to be in it. And I know that Richie is. Rich, why don't you say a few words about the project? The legend, Richie Tinkin. Yeah.
You have to find my voice. You know, I watched that, and so much of it was familiar to me because I was very good friends with, I still am with Rick Newman. Of course, I know Bud Friedman. And the comic strip happened because of those clubs. I had a bartender from the Bronx that wanted to be an impressionist, and he went up and Catch a Rising Star. And I was there one night, and the place was packed, and I'm like, whoa, wait a second. Then I found out you didn't have to pay the acts, that they would do this for nothing. So that's basically how the comic strip started. To see this Mitzi Shore from the Comedy Store, I used to own a club in Fort Lauderdale, and I would use all New York acts. And I felt that maybe I should bring some acts in from LA too. And she sent me Bob Saget, Ellen DeGeneres, and Dave Coulier. And I know that she's not feeling well now, but I want to make a point to see her now before anything happens to her. But this business is, you know, the comic strip is there 36 years, and it's been my life, and I was fortunate enough to be involved in the careers of people like Jerry Seinfeld and Eddie Murphy and Ray Romano, Adam Sandler, and Chris Rock, who used to clean the tables at the club.
Yeah, that's a story we're going to get into when we talk about the book. Yeah, that's a great
It's just been great, and something like this is great for the public to understand about comedy clubs and what it takes to be involved in something like this. So,
It's a
I think
difficult
it's great
business.
fun. No, it's not easy.
Difficult business, so it's a testament that the club is almost 37 years old. The Comic Strip is the only club that's still going strong from those days. You know, Rick opened, you know, well, Bud opened the Improv in '63, and then it wasn't until the end of '72 that Rick Newman opened Catch a Rising Star. And then it was only those two clubs until Richie opened the Comic Strip on June 1st of '76. As they said in the film, before that, comedians always performed, but they performed in nightclubs and other kind of venues. There was never a club that was dedicated to comedy until Bud created the Improv. So,
The comic strip was also the first club that ever told the comics what time they were going on. And we stuck by that.
Yeah.
So if you had a 10-10 spot, the rule was be there. I don't care where you go afterwards, but make sure you're there. And they were.
well, it was a sign of respect for the comedians, because in the early days, they'd sit for hours with no guarantee of ever getting on stage. If any other well-known comedian came in, they would get bumped. And they might not even get on that night. You know, if Robert Klein walked in, or Billy Crystal, whatever, they might do an hour of material, and the beginning comics
We
would get
did
on.
that too.
Yeah. No, but they gave them a schedule. A lot of you know Alan Combs from television as a television journalist from Hannity and Combs, but a lot of people don't know that he was a stand-up comic. And when we interviewed him for this book, Make 'em Laugh, he came in wearing his original comic strip jacket, which was like 30 years old, and looked brand new. But during his interview, he was moved to tears several times when he talked about how the strip nurtured him. He said because the other comedy clubs were so cold, this was the first club that gave comedians the respect of giving them a schedule, and they knew that at least that they would get on stage that night. And it's hard for anyone who's not in the business to understand what that means. But for comedians, they're very sensitive people. They might not look it when you see them on stage, but they are, and it's a very hard thing to try to break into a business like that, especially these days, there's so much competition. So I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience, first on the film, and then we're going to tell you some fun stories about the big stars from the book Make 'em Laugh, and we're going to end with a book signing. Richie and I will be outside, and we'll be signing books for people who want them. So who'd like to ask some questions about the business of comedy? Yes?
Yeah, and it's a wonderful film, and I appreciate it, but I go back to the days of actually going to the Dangerfields and places like that, and one thing I've noticed as an observation, and I don't know that it touched on in the film, is that content has changed. Over time, everything has changed. I get that part of it, but the comedians that we listen to today, for the most part, are willing to work, I use the word dirty, but not clean. And I'm wondering how much of an impact does that have on the business end of it itself? If you own a club, if you're doing a feature on something, in terms of touching on how that evolution is taking place.
I think Richie could answer that best.
You know, the facts are that if you curse, you're not going to get on Letterman, you're not going to get on television, and if that's what you want to do, then what's the point of cursing? Ironically, I had somebody ask me that question, and I said, I don't believe in cursing. So they said, well, you managed Eddie Murphy. And I said, well, Eddie Murphy cursed me into a lot of money. But you're right, though, it's changed tremendously. It's too dirty for me, frankly. I don't like it.
It demeans the whole business. I hate it. I'm on the scene because I write a lot about comedy, and I'm at clubs all the time. And what some of the young comics think are funny, if I owned the club, I would pull them off the stage. I wouldn't even allow them to perform because there's no creativity in what they say. It's so juvenile. They think that things are funny that you should have gotten over when you were 14 years old. And I feel very strongly about it. I was in a comedy club recently, and I walked out. I was there to perform, but when I heard what some of these young guys were saying, I said they should be embarrassed for what they're saying, because what you say on stage is a recreation of what your thoughts are, what you're thinking. If they're that sick, they belong in a psychiatrist's office, not on a stage. It's like really, very low level. And the problem is that their peers laugh to be polite, so they think it's funny, and that perpetuates the problem. But I don't think they'll ever really get any place doing that kind of stuff.
I actually had a kid one night say to me, I said, why'd you curse so much? And so I thought that's what they wanted to hear. So I said, so in other words, as you were walking up on stage, somebody said to you, hey, be dirty.
Yeah, right. Make sure you curse a lot. There's a great story about Eddie Murphy. When Eddie Murphy was on Saturday Night Live in the early days, they were running short 5 minutes on the show, and Jean Doumanian was the producer that year. And so she asked Joe Piscopo to fill in and do 5 minutes of comedy. And Joe was a big fan of Eddie Murphy, who was kind of brand new, and he suggested that Eddie do it. So Eddie, in a panic, calls Richie, who is his manager, and he says, Richie, they want me to do 5 minutes at the end. And Richie's like, that's great, what's the problem? He goes, well, I curse. So Richie says, well, then don't curse. So I just go do it. So he did it, and of course he did curse, because it was so natural for him, but he saved the show. And when it came time to renew his contract, Richie went in to meet with Jean, and she said, yeah, I'm going to renew him. And Richie said, on what level?
And he was making $750
a week as a featured.
I guess member was getting $3,000.
$3,000. So Jean said, I'm going to renew his contract as a featured player. And Richie said, listen, he saved your show. Don't you think you should make him a regular cast member? And she agreed, and he went right away from $750 a week to $3,000 a week. And that's when Richie started taking his percentage.
I called him up and I said to him, guess what? He said, what? I said, I'm going to start taking my hand now. Why? I said, because you're going to be making $3,000 a week.
$3,000 a week. Yeah, who else has a question? Karen.
Because you brought it up, okay? So the question that I have, not the comedians that just use the four-letter words and that's their entire skit, but the really sharp ones. What is it about the comedian's brain? Right? Because you have to be intelligent and articulate, but there's a different way that your brain works.
You see, comedians see the world in a whole different way than most people, which is what makes people laugh, because they see things that you relate to all the time, but you see them on one level, and a comedian sees the humor in them, and is willing to, like, comedians are wordsmiths. Good comedians are very intelligent. They're usually very shy also, but they spent their life observing. And what I do, I see things that are funny to me all the time. And most people just go about their day experiencing things, but they don't see the humor. And that's what comedians do. They point out the humor in things that you experience all the time.
A comedian could walk into a morgue and find something funny.
Exactly, during a funeral. And some of them might not even be able to hold back till the funeral was over. Yeah, this fellow over here had a question in the red sweatshirt.
I just wanted to know, one of the comedians said that it took like 10 years for her to find herself on stage, and most comics that long. Sometimes when you think that top comics, they'd have somebody come along the way and say, look, you're going this way, but I can help you find yourself, and give them a little guidance, or would you say they just found themselves naturally on their own?
Are you talking about establishing a comedy identity?
Right.
Because that's one of the most important things. When I work with comics, that's one of the first things that we work on, is to find who you are on stage. Rodney Dangerfield probably had the best identity, the no respect thing. Very few comics have such a strong hook. If you're lucky, you can get that. Joan Rivers had one, Not every comic can do that. But that's where your material should come from. If you have an identity, then the material just flows, and you segue from one bit to another. One comedian should not be able to do another comedian's jokes. They should be that personalized. So when I write for people, I have to think in their head. I can't write from my head. I have to write words that they would say. And if you have an identity, then it makes it a lot easier to do that.
One night at the Strip, they all decided to trade material. So Jerry did George Wallace's act. Well, I listened to Jerry's improvise. It did so it was like, well, it sucked. And it was,
Yeah, because when you're
I
together
never
every
did it
night,
again.
you wind up learning the other guy's jokes. You hear them all the time.
Yeah, they all
So you start to
have.
know their act. In the back, yeah.
Tell me, how did you discover your voice as an owner? As an owner of one of the comedy stores?
I used to own a bar in the Bronx, and my bartender did impressions. And he asked me to come watch him at this place, Catch a Rising Star, and he was going to go up. So I said, all right, I had 10 other guys with me, and we went there on a Monday night, and the place was packed. And at 12 o'clock, I said, Tony, we're going to get drunk. What time are you going up? He said, oh, I'll find out. So then he came back and said to me, you're not going to believe this. And I said, what? He said, I just asked the owner, that's Rick Newman. I told him I was supposed to go up at 11:15, and now it's 12 o'clock. And Rick said to him, hey, I'm not worried about customers. So I said, you know what, he's right. So I looked around, I said, and Tony said to me, why don't you open up one of these? So I said, I'm not in show business, I'm a bar owner. So I watched it for about 2 weeks, and the place was busy every night. And then I found out you don't pay the acts. So that's why I got into it.
And so we're going to kind of segue from, oh, you have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can like you do something like, and it's not funny, and then like that person does something funny with it? Does it still count as your joke?
Does it still count? You mean if someone changes your joke?
So like you do
But the-
something and you tell them to do that thing, like, and they do the funny part, does it still count as your joke?
That's so cute. I don't know what you mean though.
Is it your idea?
If someone
Is it your
changes your
idea, it's
idea,
funny.
if someone changes your idea and makes it funnier, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, then you both share you both share the credit on that. If you do it together, you share the credit. Yes, over here. There's a question. Good. You right over there. Yeah.
Not really so much a question, but when Buddy Hackett used to be on Johnny Carson's show, which he was frequently, I thought he was a riot, especially with that round face and rubber face. When I got out to Las Vegas one time, he was performing, so I went to see him. He was somewhere between crutch jokes and toilet jokes the entire time.
Most people don't notice, but Johnny Carson was one of the dirtiest comedians there was.
So is Milton Berle, who always told people, don't work blue. That was his favorite thing to say. Milton was my sponsor in the Friars Club, and I got to know him really well. Talking about Buddy Hackett, when I wrote a joke for... Buddy Hackett was being roasted, and Milton wanted something to say about him. It was the first time I worked with Milton, and he said to me, tell me 2 jokes, and I'll see if I'll let you work with me. I said, clean or dirty? And one of the jokes was, a lot of people like to think of Buddy Hackett as a little man with a rubber face. I prefer to think of him as a little rubber with a man's face. And he said, Jeffrey, you got the job. And that's how I started working for Milton Berle. Who else has a question? Yes?
Where has the idea originated that both clowns and comedians are basically sad people?
Well, that's interesting, because a lot of people say that comedy comes from pain. Most comedians that I know were the people who didn't really fit in high school, although probably no one really fit in high school. I always say, if high school was the best time of your life, you should probably kill yourself. You know?
Most comics are very introverted. Off stage, they're very quiet. But when they get on stage, it's over.
Their personality comes out on stage. Yeah, and some people have the ability to take pain and turn it into laughter. Like these comedy warriors. You know, I was fascinated by them. I went to see them 2 nights ago. And these were guys with horrible injuries. One was a severe burn victim. And they were both so funny. And the weird thing was, I said it to them too, I said, if it hadn't been for your injuries, you probably would not be on stage performing comedy. You know, there are definitely easier ways to get into the business. You know what I'm saying? There has to, I know it's a hard business to get into, but yeah, there has to be easier ways than that. But, you know, they talk about comedy. The words in comedy are so violent. They say, you know, they killed, they destroyed, they devastated the room, they tore them up, you know. These guys really went through violence to get into comedy. And so it's true that very often comedy comes from pain. That you can turn the negative things in your life into something funny that people relate to, because everybody has pain in their lives. And they just don't know how to deal with it. And comedians show you that you can laugh at almost anything. So it's a great healing force, which is one of the things I love about comedy. I'm going to segue a little bit. We're going to still take questions, but into the book, Make 'em Laugh, because this was a project, it's tied in with this. Richie's in it. I'm in it. This is a book that Richie and I worked on for 4 years. And it's the story of the club. It's how this club got started and how it's still thriving today. The reason it took 4 years is because it took that long to interview all these people. Chris Rock wrote an amazing introduction. And Chris was discovered in the club by Eddie Murphy in 1986. Eddie walked in one night, and at the time, he was the biggest film star in the world. He had already done Beverly Hills Cop 1. And he was literally the biggest star in the world, and Richie was managing him. They loved when Eddie would come to the club, because the audience would be thrilled. And they didn't want him to leave. And Eddie walks in one night and he says, "Are there any black comics I can see?" And in those days, believe it or not, there were hardly any black comics. Today, there are hardly any white comics. But in those days, there were hardly any black comics. All that was there was Chris. And Chris Rock was 19 years old. And he was setting up chairs in exchange for stage time. That was his deal. He set up the chairs, they'd let him perform. But he'd go on late night for like 6 drunks at 2 in the morning, you know? So now his idol, Eddie Murphy, is there. And he gets a chance to go on stage, and the place is packed, because it's like a Friday night. There's over 200 people there. And so just imagine how he must have felt, how nervous he would be. 19 years old, going on stage for his idol. And he went up and he killed it. Talk about violent terms. He totally killed it. According to Chris, he says he didn't do that well. He said there was a comic named Joe Bolster who was probably funnier than him. But he did well enough that Eddie Murphy stuck around and gave him his phone number. And they hung out in the club. And Eddie wound up inviting him to come to LA with him to do reshoots for the movie Golden Child. Chris said to me, he had never been on a plane, he never stayed in a hotel before. He said, "I'm a kid from Bed-Stuy." He had 7 brothers. He goes, "We never even had a shrimp cocktail. My father used to buy 1 shrimp and cut it into 7 pieces. And so I said, "Did you go?" He says, "Of course I went." He borrowed clothes from his brothers, and he went on the plane, and they took him, and they stayed at a very fancy hotel. And Richie, L'Hermitage, and Richie noticed that Chris wasn't eating, and because he was afraid he'd have to pay for the food, and he had no money. And Richie said, "Don't worry, man, it's on Paramount. You know, Chris is taking care of it. I'm sorry, Eddie's taking care of it." And as a result of that trip, Eddie Murphy created a part in Beverly Hills Cop 2 for Chris Rock.
Yeah, Chris
That's a valet.
He's a valet in the movie. That part wasn't in the script, but Eddie made them put him in.
He made that part for him, and that's what made Chris's career. So when Chris was leaving that day, Richie remembers this, and this story is in the book. So many stories are in here, but Richie remembers Chris turning around to him and yelling, "Hey, Rich!" And Rich said, "What, Chris?" And Chris goes, "Don't forget me, man." And Richie said, "I'll never forget you." And he called New York and he spoke to Lucian Hold, who was the legendary guy who ran the comic strip for 25 years, because when Richie was with Eddie Murphy, he spent a lot of time in Los Angeles. So a guy named Lucian Hold was the one who had to pass the comedians and choose who would go on stage. And he called Lucian and he said, "When Chris Rock comes back to New York, make sure you give him good spots. Put him on at 9, 10 o'clock. And again, that's what made Chris's career. So Chris has always been grateful to Richie, which is not a common thing. People tend to forget where they came from, but Chris didn't. And that's why he wrote this great introduction to this book. He wrote a really funny 5-page introduction that he sent us from the Cannes Film Festival. Remember that? He was in France. And we're like, "Chris, we need this introduction." And so he sent it all the way from the Cannes Film Festival.
I said to him, "I'll have Jimmy Madrid write it for you." And you just looked at it. He said, "No, I want to write it." And then he sent it. Yeah.
He wrote it himself. He said he may not have gone to college, but the comic strip was his college. That's where he got his education. And now his younger brother, Jordan Rock, works there. His brother Tony Rock comes in. Tony's hosting the new Jamie Foxx show live at the Apollo, and Richie managed him as well. So in this book, we have interviews from Jerry Seinfeld. I went out to LA to interview Billy Crystal, Ray Romano, Paul Reiser, Gilbert Gottfried, Susie Essman, and all the big stars, Jim Gaffigan, Lisa Lampanelli.
When we first started writing the book, Jeffrey said to me, well, what you would do, have them come to my house. So I said, no, make them come to the comic strip, because they'll remember things when they're in there. And they did. Jackie Martin, we couldn't shut him up, he kept going about.
Jackie Martin gave us the longest interview, we had about 2 hours. It was amazing, but he's a master. The way he knows jokes, that's how he remembered stories. He remembered everything that ever happened to him. And yeah, there's a bunch of color pictures in here of Seinfeld and Eddie Murphy in the early days. There's a lot of memorabilia. As a matter of fact, Jerry Seinfeld's first sign-up sheet is in here. The club opened June 1st to '76, and on June 17th, Jerry Seinfeld walked into audition. And in those days, they rated the comedians. And there was so he was rated good. They wrote down that he was good.
Invite him back.
And definitely invite him back on Monday. And so we have that in the book. There's like a lot of memorabilia. Joe Piscopo before he started working out. You know, Gilbert Gottfried in the early days. And there's actually a picture, we didn't know it. The day that we decided to do this book, we were at the Strip and Ann Curry was there to try to learn how to do stand-up comedy. And Gilbert Gottfried was there, and we took a picture, the four of us, and that was the day I said to Rich, you know, somebody should really do a book on this club, because there's never been a club like this that launched so many careers. And I didn't know at the time that a lot of people had suggested it to him, but he came to my house the same way that these guys came to my house. And he said, I think you have more pictures than I have at the club, because maybe you're the guy who could do this. And he trusted me with it.
You know, all those years, it just never occurred to me that I should write a book about this, until he said that. And I was like, you know what, that is pretty interesting.
He's a very humble guy, that's why. Are there any more questions? Please, yeah.
Yes. Would you talk about the role of the audience? I'm in New York and Long Island Comic. In fact, this is the first time I'm going to meet you in person. And could you talk about how important the audience is, that they're integral to having an audience there for the comic to play off of and to react to, and also about the problem we have now with etiquette and people you've alluded to that, people mentioning when someone is on, even though they know there are more comics coming, they'll think of nothing of walking out. You wouldn't do that if you were at a Broadway show or a night of several plays, you know, unless they were terrible. You know, and it's very good at keeping people using their cellular phones in the theater and texting, and it's a major problem. It's become such a problem. I know many of the people that are local.
You know, it's funny that you talk about that, because we have a rule, and the MC announces it before the show, do not have your phone on. If you have to text, go outside. As a matter of fact, one of the guys says that, and then he says, and if you have to use your pager, forget about it, because your pager's died so many years ago. But you know what happens? We probably put on 6 or 7 or 8 comics a night. So people are there from the beginning of the show, and now it's 10 o'clock, and there's still a couple more acts, and they haven't left. Yeah, it's like, let's see what this guy's like, and if they don't like him, they're gonna get up and leave. So you can't stop them from leaving. So we just make sure they pay their check, that's all.
Well, in terms of an audience, I want to say that you guys have been great, and I think with a little hard work, you could become a well-known audience. Thank you very much. And we're going to be outside. If anybody has any other questions, we're going to be signing books at a table. If anybody would like a book, we're having a special in honor of the festival. It's going to be discounted, and Richie and I will sign it for you. You'll have a chance to ask Gary and Scott any questions you want. We'll be outside. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you,
and for supporting comedy.